dweller of the dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten, or climbing out of the tombs. Check out our links below for more information. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of Black Bayou to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls for now. Children of horror, legion of ghouls. Tonight, we present the legendary beast who loved to steal hearts, literally. We present another in the series from our Jack the Ripper collection. This is horror master Robert Bloch's Ripping Yarn, a Toy for Juliette. First written in 1967 for Dangerous Visions. We promise this child's tale will leave you all torn up. Enjoy. A Toy for Juliette by Robert Bloch. Juliette entered her bedroom smiling, and 1,000 Juliettes smiled back at her. For all the walls were paneled with mirrors, and the ceiling was set with inlaid panes that reflected her image. Wherever she glanced, she could see the blonde curls framing the sensitive features of a face that was a radiant amalgam of both child and angel, a striking contrast to the rich, ripe revelation of her body in the filmy robe. But Juliette wasn't smiling at herself. She smiled because she knew that grandfather was back, and he'd brought her another toy. In just a few moments, it would be decontaminated and delivered, and she wanted to be ready. Juliette turned the ring on her finger, and the mirrors dimmed. Another turn would darken the room entirely. A twist in the opposite direction would bring them blazing into brilliance. It was all a matter of choice. But then, that was the secret of life. To choose for pleasure. And what was her pleasure tonight? Juliette advanced to one of the mirror panels and passed her hand before it. The glass slid to one side, revealing the niche behind it. The coffin-shaped opening in the solid rock, with the boot and thumb screws set at the proper heights. For a moment, she hesitated. She hadn't played that game in years. Another time, perhaps, Juliette waved her hand, and the mirror moved to cover the opening again. She wandered along the row of panels, gesturing as she walked, pausing to inspect what was behind each mirror in turn. Here was the rack. There the stocks, with the barbed whips resting against the dark-stained wood. And here was the dissecting table, hundreds of years old, with its quaint instruments. Behind the next panel, the electrical prods and wires that produced such weird grimaces and contortions of agony, to say nothing of screams. Of course, the screams didn't matter in a soundproofed room. Juliette moved to the side wall and waved her hand again. The obedient glass slid away, and she stared at a plaything she'd almost forgotten. It was one of the first things Grandfather had ever given her, and it was very old, almost like a mummy case. What had he called it? The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. That was it. With the sharpened steel spikes set inside the lid, you chained a man inside, and you turned the little crank that closed the lid ever so slowly, and the spikes pierced the wrist and the elbows, the ankles and the knees, the groin and the eyes. You had to be careful not to get excited and turn too quickly, or you'd spoil the fun. Grandfather had shown her how it worked the first time he brought her a real live toy. But then Grandfather had shown her everything. He'd taught her all she knew, for he was very wise. He'd even given her name, Juliette, from one of the old-fashioned printed books he'd discovered by the philosopher de Sade. Grandfather had brought the books from the past, just as he'd brought the playthings for her. He was the only one who had access to the past because he owned the Traveler. The Traveler was a very ingenious mechanism capable of attaining vibrational frequencies which freed it from the time bind. At rest, it was just a big square box-like shape, the size of a small room. But when Grandfather took over the controls and the oscillation started, the box would blur and disappear. It was still there, Grandfather said. At least the matrix remained as a fixed point in space and time. But anything or anyone within the square could move freely into the past to wherever the controls were programmed. Of course, they would be invisible when they arrived, but that was actually an advantage, particularly when it came to finding things and bringing them back. Grandfather had brought back some very interesting objects from almost mythical places. The Great Library of Alexandria, the Pyramid of Cheops, the Kremlin, the Vatican, Fort Knox, all the storehouses of treasure and knowledge which existed thousands of years ago. He liked to go to that part of the past, the period before the thermonuclear wars and the robotic ages, and collect things. Of course, books and jewels and metals were useless except to an antiquarian, but Grandfather was a romanticist and loved the olden times. It was strange to think of him owning the Traveler, but of course he hadn't actually created it. Juliette's father was really the one who built it, and Grandfather took possession of it after her father died. Juliette suspected Grandfather had killed her father and mother when she was just a baby, but she could never be sure. Not that it mattered. Grandfather was always very good to her, and besides, soon he would die, and she'd own the traveler herself. They used to joke about it frequently.
"I've made you into a monster,"
he'd say.
"and someday you'll end up by destroying me. After which, of course, you'll go on to destroy the entire world, or what little remains of it."
"Aren't you afraid?" she'd tease.
"Certainly not. That's my dream. The destruction of everything. An end to all this sterile decadence. Do you realize that at one time there were more than 3 billion inhabitants on this planet? And now, less than 3,000. Less than 3,000 shut up inside these domes, prisoners of themselves, and sealed away forever, thanks to the sins of the fathers,
who poisoned not only the outside world, but outer space by meddling with the atomic order of the universe.
Humanity is virtually extinct already. You will merely hasten the finale."
"But couldn't we all go back to another time in the Traveler?" she asked.
"Back to what time? The continuum is changeless. One event leads inexorably to another. All links in a chain which binds us
to the present and its inevitable end
in destruction.
We'd have temporary individual survival, yes, but to no purpose. And none of us are fitted to survive in a more primitive environment.
So let us stay here and take what pleasure we can from the moment. My pleasure is to be the sole user and possessor of the Traveler."
"And yours, Juliette." Grandfather laughed then. They both laughed because they knew what her pleasure was. Juliette killed her first toy when she was 11, a little boy. It had been brought to her as a special gift from grandfather from somewhere in the past for elementary sex play, but it wouldn't cooperate, and she lost her temper and beat it to death with a steel rod. So grandfather brought her an older toy with brown skin, and it cooperated very well. But in the end, she tired of it, and one day when it was sleeping in her bed, she tied it down and found a knife. Experimenting a little before it died, Juliette discovered new sources of pleasure. And of course, grandfather found out. That's when he'd christened her Juliette. He seemed to approve most highly, and from then on, he brought her the playthings she kept behind the mirrors in her bedroom. And on his restless rovings into the past, he brought her new toys. Being invisible, he could find them for her almost anywhere on his travels. All he did was to use a stunner and transport them when he returned. Of course, each toy had to be very carefully decontaminated. The past was teeming with strange microorganisms. But once the toys were properly antiseptic, they were turned over to Juliette for her pleasure. And during the past 7 years, she had enjoyed herself. It was always delicious, this moment of anticipation before a new toy arrived. What would it be like? Grandfather was most considerate. Mainly, he made sure that the toys he brought her could speak and understand Anglish, or English, as they used to call it in the past. Verbal communication was often important, particularly if Juliette wanted to follow the precepts of the philosopher, the sod, and enjoy some form of sex relation before going on to keener pleasures. But there was still the guessing beforehand. Would this toy be young or old, wild or tame, male or female? She'd had all kinds and every possible combination. Sometimes she kept them alive for days before tiring of them, or before the subtleties of which she was capable caused them to expire. At other times, she wanted it to happen quickly. Tonight, for example, she knew she could be soothed only by the most primitive and direct action. Once Juliette realized this, she stopped playing with her mirror panels and went directly to the big bed. She pulled back the coverlet, groped under the pillow until she felt it. Yes, it was still there. The big knife with the long, cruel blade. She knew what she would do now. Take the toy to bed with her, and then, at precisely the proper moment, combine her pleasures. If she could time her knife thrust. She shivered with anticipation, then with impatience. What kind of toy would it be? She remembered the suave, cool one. Benjamin Bathurst was his name, an English diplomat from the time of what grandfather called the Napoleonic Wars. Oh, he'd been suave and cool enough until she beguiled him with her body into the bed. And there'd been that American aviatrix from slightly later on in the past. And once, as a very special treat, the entire crew of a sailing vessel called the Marie Celeste. They had lasted for weeks. Strangely enough, she even read about some of her toys afterwards, because when grandfather approached them with his stunner and brought them here, they disappeared forever from the past. And if they were in any way known or important in their time, such disappearances were noted. And some of grandfather's books had accounts of the mysterious vanishing which took place and was, of course, never explained. How delicious it all was! Juliette patted the pillow back into place and slid the knife under it. She couldn't wait now. What was delaying things? She forced herself to move to a vent and depress the sprayer, shedding her robe as the perfumed mist bathed her body. It was the final allurement. But why didn't her toy arrive? Suddenly, grandfather's voice came over the auditor.
I'm sending you a little surprise, dearest.
That's what he always said. It was part of the game. Juliette depressed the communicator toggle.
Don't tease,
She begged.
tell me, what's it like? An Englishman, late Victorian era, very prim and proper by the looks of him.
Young, handsome,
Passable.
grandfather chuckled.
Your appetites betray you, dearest. Who is it? Someone from the books? I wouldn't know the name. We found no identification during the decontamination,
But from his dress
and manner, and the little black bag he carried when I discovered him so early in the morning,
I'd judge him to be a physician returning from an emergency call. Juliette knew about physicians from her reading, of course, just as she knew what Victorian meant. Somehow the combination seemed exactly right.
prim and proper?
She giggled.
Then I'm afraid it's due for a shock.
Grandfather laughed.
You have something in mind, I take it? Yes. Can I watch? Please, not this time. Very well. Don't be mad, darling. I love you.
Juliette switched off, just in time, too, because the door was opening and the toy came in. She stared at it, realizing that grandfather had told the truth. The toy was a male of 30-odd years, attractive, but by no means handsome. It couldn't be in that dark garb and those ridiculous side whiskers. There was something almost depressingly refined and mannered about it, an air of embarrassed repression. And of course, when it caught sight of Juliette in her revealing robe and the bed surrounded by mirrors, it actually began to blush. That reaction won Juliette completely. A blushing Victorian with the build of a bull, and
Unaware that this was the slaughterhouse.
it was so amusing she couldn't restrain herself. She moved forward at once and put her arms around it. Who are you? Where am I? The usual questions voiced in the usual way. Ordinarily, Juliette would have amused herself by parrying with answers designed to tantalize and titillate her victim. But tonight, she felt an urgency which only increased as she embraced the toy and pressed it back toward the waiting bed. The toy began to breathe heavily, responding, but it was still bewildered.
Tell me, I don't understand. Am I alive, or is this heaven?
Juliette's robe fell open as she lay back. "You're alive, darling," she murmured. "Wonderfully alive." She laughed as she began to prove the statement. "But closer to heaven than you think." And to prove that statement, her free hand slid under the pillow and groped for the waiting knife. But the knife wasn't there anymore. Somehow, it had already found its way into the toy's hand. And the toy wasn't prim and proper any longer. Its face was something glimpsed in nightmare. Just a glimpse before the blinding blur of the knife blade as it came down again and again and again. The room, of course, was soundproof, and there was plenty of time. They didn't discover what was left of Juliette's body for several days. Back in London, after the final mysterious murder in the early morning hours, they never did find Jack the Ripper. Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.